Hi, I'm Sherry Byrne-Haber. I'm an accessibility architect with VMware, and I'm here with my colleague, Tamar Severe, who is our accessibility operations lead. We're really happy to be presenting today at the Out and Equal Workplace Summit on accessible events. We want events to be inclusive of people with disabilities. So our agenda for today is 5 parts. We're going to talk about the basic concepts of disability and accessibility. We're going to talk about what not being accessible costs in the way of financial costs and also reputation damage and harm. We're going to give you an actionable set of checklists where you can figure out how to make your events more accessible going forward, and along with a list of references and takeaways. So first of all, what is disability? Now, everybody pretty much already has a mental image of what disability means to them, but we're going to talk about it in a pretty global way, which is disability affects more than 20% of the population, or 1.3 million people, 1.3 billion people globally. So there are different kinds of disabilities. First of all, there are permanent disabilities. And an example here is a limb difference. You're congenitally born maybe with a deformed hand or with your arm ending slightly below your shoulder. But there are also temporary and situational disabilities that will exhibit the same symptoms, but for a shorter period of time. So let's say you need rotator cuff surgery and you are in one of those stranglehold kind of braces. You're not going to be able to use your arm, and you might as well have a limb difference for all intents and purposes until you've recovered from your rotator cuff surgery. Situationally, another example would be holding a baby or holding groceries. You can't use your arm for anything else at that point related to a computer because your arm is tied up with what you're holding. So when you think about disability, you need to think about all of these things and not just permanent disabilities. There are 6 different categories of disabilities altogether. There's neurological and cognitive disabilities. Some people use the term neurodiverse. That would include things like autism, dyslexia, attention deficit disorder, and any type of intellectual or developmental delay. There are speech differences, which may or may not be related to hearing loss. Sometimes they are related, sometimes they're independent. There's mobility and dexterity issues, people who use crutches, wheelchairs, walkers, or may have issues with fine motor control due to issues that impact their hands. There's vision loss, ranging all the way from just needing to wear glasses to read all the way up to complete blindness. Hearing loss, again, which can range from I have trouble hearing soft women's voices all the way up to complete and total profound deafness. And then there's other. You know, what comes under other? Other is going to include things like diabetes and recovering from cancer treatment, chronic pain conditions, things that just don't fit in any one of these other categories. Mental health conditions are a pretty big chunk of what comes under other. So when you think about disability, you probably think of people like Stephen Hawking, who have visible disabilities. And about 25 to 30% of disabilities are visible. You can look at the person, you can tell that they have a disability. If you see my insulin pump, if you see my daughter's hearing aids, if you see me using a cane or in a wheelchair, you can tell immediately that we have a disability. 75% of disabilities, however, are invisible. And so that included some of the ones that I listed under other. It also includes things like chronic fatigue syndrome and traumatic brain injury. So people with disabilities frequently use assistive technology in order to interface with the internet. They can take something that they can't do or perceive, and through assistive technology, they can turn it into something that they can do or perceive. So this video is my favorite accessibility video of all time. In 90 seconds, it will teach you everything that you need to know about assistive technology. So I want you, while you're watching this video, to count all the forms of assistive technology that you see.
people think that having a disability is a barrier. But that's not the way I see it. You can catch up with friends.
Ready?
You can capture a moment with your family.
One face, small face, focus lock.
And you can start the day bright and early. You can take a trip to somewhere new. You can concentrate on every word of a story.
A bird began to sing. Jack opened his eyes.
You can take the long way home. Or edit a film like this one. When technology is designed for everyone, it lets anyone do what they love, including me.
So you gotta love movies with a twist, right? Because Sadie was the film editor for this. She put together all the different pieces of video and works for Apple. So just in case you haven't seen an example of somebody using assistive technology, I want to give you a little feel for what it means to me. So my daughter has a significant level of hearing loss. And before Apple had their iPhone pair with hearing aids, she could not communicate by telephone. And she also lost the ability to speak Mandarin. She was born Mandarin speaking and spoke Mandarin with her father's side of the family. And her hearing loss is progressive. And so she eventually lost the ability to understand Mandarin. She could still speak it, but she couldn't hear it or interpret it. And when that happened, she was about 15 years old, you know, the tough teenage years. And she used to identify as primarily Chinese and secondarily Caucasian on her school forms, and she actually flipped it the other way around. She started identifying herself as primarily Caucasian and secondarily Chinese when she lost her ability to speak Mandarin. When Apple allowed her Bluetooth hearing aids to be paired to her iPhone, not only could she communicate on the phone for things like calling 911, but she could also speak with her relatives by the phone in Mandarin because her hearing aid programs were sufficiently robust that she could fine-tune them to give her the input that she needed to hear the vowel tones, which are very tricky. So yeah, assistive technology is pushing around in a wheelchair and getting some blinds to open automatically, but it's also can impact things as profound as cultural identity and the ability to call 911 when you see danger. And those things are really, really important to anybody, including a person with disabilities.
And this is a really good segment because we do want to click, kind of like double click on what is accessibility. So we talked about disability and you know, the spectrum and different kinds, but let's double click on what is accessibility. And there's a lot of kinds, as you said, like there's a lot of kinds of different definitions for accessibility. And I don't really think, you know, we don't really think in definition. What we do know is that we see a lot more accessibility working its way into life around us every single day. And that can be with new technology, with old technology, you know, different scenarios. We saw it in the video. We wanted to share some of these things with you. There are accessibility features and accessibility centered products that are around us all the time and every day. You just need to know to look for them. Just to give you like a little bit of a glimpse, this is probably one of my favorite examples of accessibility. And this is very modern accessibility within, you know, the last couple of years. Microsoft invented and created and released a new thing called the Xbox Adaptive Controller. And you see in the picture that I'm showing a gentleman with mobility and dexterity disability. and he's sitting in a wheelchair. And he has a strap around his chest to help him sit upright. And on his hands, there's a brace on the wrist to help him as he is operating the joysticks. Now, each of these joysticks and switches that you see on the little pad in front of him, they're all arranged as a gaming controller. The ones by his left hand to, the right hand side of the picture or further off to the top of the photo, you'll see 4 little micro switches that are all arranged in cross pattern. That is effectively his directional pad, and he replaced the directional pad of the stock Expo control with these switches. And this is all being facilitated by the Xbox adaptive controller that was designed specifically for people that have disability and are also gamers. And you see, up by the top of the left of his head, and you saw it in Sadie as well, he has a big yellow button. And this is his A button, probably one of the one that he uses, most. And he's playing games with, with this new ways that we might not be able to, or, haven't been able to before that. So some really good and interesting things that are going on in terms of accessibility. And you're probably familiar with accessibility features in the physical world, like, ramps in the buildings or ramps to the entrance to stores or restrooms. This one was from an event I attended in Seattle. ATMs, and this is from RBC Bank, so in Canada. So I think it was back in 2010, all RBC's branch banking machines, they have voice guidance enabled, and each of those branches, in each of their branch locations, they have at least one dedicated wheelchair accessible ATM that meets, the standards. This is an image of the Magical Bridge playground in Palo Alto, California. And the idea of play space designed for all ages and all abilities was actually a brainchild of a woman called Olenka Villarreal. After the birth of her second daughter, Olenka realized that for children and families with different needs, a trip to the playground could be challenging and sometimes isolating. So Olenka and the team worked for, I think, about 7 years to raise funds and build an outdoor play space that would welcome visitors of every ages and every ability. And the results was the Palo Alto's Magical Bridge Playground. And I think that now they also opened a few more in other cities in the Bay Area. I know that there are other countries as well around the world that do that. But again, accessibility is all around us. We just have to look for those. And if you have ever watched any video online, this is a fairly standard video player, right? And it is very common to see these days features like, those buttons for transcript or closed captioning to be part of the video player itself. And today we'll be talking about accessible event and meeting and conferences. And this is all about inclusion, right? So when a teammate or a participant cannot understand what is happening within a panel or a presentation or a team meeting, when a person feels that an event is impossible to physically navigate safely and effectively and thoroughly enjoy the experience and be able to participate as much as anyone else, then that space doesn't feel welcoming to them. By not thinking about accessibility, you're actually excluding potential audience. So again, these are just a few examples to show you that accessibility is all around us. Accessibility is an area that continues to grow and continue to expand. We get new technologies and we come up with new ways of doing things, and we continue to adapt to the ever-changing environment. And we have the responsibility as managers, as program managers, as designers, as developers, as content creators, and event planners to make sure that all things that we create are accessible to people of all abilities. And this is what we're talking about today. So obviously these were just a few examples, and we didn't cover everything. This is just scratching the surface, but we really wanted to share some of those concepts with you, partially because we would love for you to be able to walk away from here noticing more accessibility out there and be more aware of the different ways that people are solving accessibility issues out in the real world. And now Sherry's going to talk about some of the costs of being unaccessible. So inaccessibility, what does that look like?
I started off with a computer science degree and then ended up going to law school. So putting my lawyer hat on here for a moment, we're going to talk about what it costs when you're not accessible. So there are positives to accessibility. You're going to be reaching out to an audience, 18% of your people, that you wouldn't otherwise be able to be reaching if you're not accessible. Nobody wakes up in the morning as a product owner and says, hey, I want to cut 18% of my audience out of the potential market, on day one. But that's effectively what you're doing if your products and all of your events associated with your products aren't accessible. Accessibility definitely gives you a little bit of a halo effect with respect to brand reputation. And people with disabilities, you need to make your own products accessible and your own events accessible in order to support disabled employees. Disabled employees are much more loyal in terms of job changing. If they find a place that treats them well, they are not going to leave. So there's reduced employee turnover that's associated with being accessible. And also there's some great studies out by Accenture that talk about diversity in general, including disability in the workplace, and companies that are more diverse, including efforts related to disability, have higher ROI, higher profits, and more shareholder value. Now, if people with disabilities were employed at the same rate as people without disabilities, the gross domestic product in the US would increase by $25 billion. Prior to COVID, people with disabilities experienced an unemployment rate approximately 2.5 times higher than people without disabilities. Post-COVID, it's actually gotten worse. More than half of people with disabilities have either lost their jobs or fear losing their jobs, as opposed to 28% of people without disabilities. So COVID's had a much more disproportionate impact on people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And obviously, inclusion is important. Millennials in particular value inclusion. In fact, that's pretty much their number one consideration when they're looking at new jobs. If you as a company can demonstrate that you're including with people with disabilities, that's going to make you a more attractive workplace. Okay, now, so that was the carrot, here's the stick. There have been 4,600 lawsuits filed in the US alone in the last 2 years over inaccessibility. So the Americans with Disabilities Act long predates the internet, but the courts are interpreting the equal access part of the Americans with Disabilities Act saying, hey, that applies to the internet too. So lawsuits are very expensive. There are your legal costs. You have to pay for experts. You might have to pay for mediation and arbitration. There are going to be opportunity costs. You're going to have to pull your engineers off of what they're working on and put them on accessibility, or you're going to have to pay additional contractors to come on board to handle accessibility. There's going to be settlement costs. There's going to be tag-along lawsuits. Once you're sued by one person, you're open to being sued by anybody until you solve your accessibility problems. So why am I saying this like it's a done deal? It's because 98% of these lawsuits are being decided in favor of the plaintiffs when they go to court, or the people who are being sued are settling with the plaintiffs so that a court case isn't involved. But if you settle the suit with the one plaintiff and you don't solve your underlying accessibility problems, you just threw shark chum into the water, because all the other plaintiffs, and we literally have quote unquote professional plaintiffs out there who do nothing but going around looking for companies that are inaccessible and suing them and collecting usually $25,000 paydays with every lawsuit. And then of course you also have to pay the legal fees for that person's attorney, and that can be several $100,000, as well as the legal fees for your own attorneys. So lots of costs associated with inaccessibility. It really takes a village to make a company or an event completely accessible. We have to make sure that the presenters create accessible materials. We have to make sure that the event planners have figured out how to make the platforms accessible. Eventually, we will go back to having events in person. There's even more concerns with accessibility for physical spaces than there are for digital spaces. There's training that has to be done. There are going to be communications around the event. Stuff is going to be bought. And the people with disabilities might have questions and might need to be supported. So somebody needs to provide user support to your potentially disabled attendees, and somebody's going to need to provide support to the procurement, the presenters, the event planners, the training people, and the communications people to make sure that everybody is locked in to the same accessibility standard and executing on all pages.
And so, what can you actually do to make events or meetings or conferences more accessible? And it would be impossible for us to answer all of these things in just 1 hour, even less than that. There's no, shortage of things that we can do. But we wanted to boil this down into 4 areas to focus on, 4 things and briefly elaborate on each of them. And as soon as we do that, then you know that you're probably leaving a lot of important things. But we want to run through these 4 with you so you get a better sense of things that you can do starting today to create more accessible, inclusive, virtual or live events or meeting or conferences. So the 4 focus areas are marketing, registration, the event itself, and the event follow-up. So starting off with marketing first. Now, more often than not, accommodating accessibility is often an afterthought in event marketing, or not even a thought at all. But when we're planning an event or meeting or conference, this is actually the first thing to think about, because if your marketing material is not accessible, you're unintentionally excluding many people, and as a result, significantly increases your audience size. So, social media. Send information in text format, not image, unless image descriptions are being provided as well through emails or apps to allow your guests to use assistive technology such as screen readers access to any necessary information. If you're posting promotional videos, make sure that these videos have closed captioning. So people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or people who English is their second language, can read and access necessary information about the event. The website and submission process you're using should meet the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, and be tested for usability when fonts are enlarged and when style sheets are turned off and when images are turned off and without using a mouse, right? So test using keyboard-only navigation. The website should provide information about the conference accessibility and the good and bad, so that participants with disabilities can review it in advance and know how to prepare or decide if they will be able, they should expect any issues for them with attending. So you need to let participants know about, how and when to notify the organizer about accessibility needs. Participants need to have information about accessibility of the venue, if it's an in-person event, right? So things like transportation to and from the venue. Note things like presence of curve cuts, details of local information services and content people in the venue, right? So who can I reach out to if I have any questions, and where are they located? If you're planning any social events, are these events accessible? And then the site should provide details and advanced registrations for those as well. Moving on into the registration process, right? So we talk about marketing our site. As part of the registration process, include a place for participants to indicate accessibility requirements and clarify any deadlines, such as a request for sign language interpretation before the close of the early registration. Include a space to include any dietary requirements, included religious dietary requirements or allergy. If they come with service animals, there might be accommodations to consider around that. So allow registrants to request access to power outlets, sitting arrangement, and assign someone from your team, your organizing team, to follow up with registrants to clarify requests, to just making sure that they have all the information that they need in order for them to participate and be part of the event, fully and meaningfully. Sherry's going to talk about the event itself now.
Yeah, before I get into the event itself, you might be thinking, oh, I use C-Event, or I use On24 or Eventbrite. I'm not going to get sued over that. That's their problem. Well, surprise, the courts wouldn't agree with you on that. So people are responsible for the accessibility of their subcontractors. If you have chosen to work with someone and they are inaccessible, their inaccessibility almost guaranteed will be imputed to you in a lawsuit. Now, yeah, you might have a great cross claim, as us lawyers call it, where you can say, okay, this amount of the damages was attributable to Eventbrite being inaccessible. But that it's better not to have the lawsuit and not to have the claim to begin with. Do not rely on your third-party vendors to be accessible. Ask them when you're evaluating them. Okay, so now talking about physical space, one of my favorite topics as a wheelchair user. Safety is, of course, of everybody's paramount concern, and people who are in wheelchairs are no different in that regard. So you need to notify security, for example, in the place that you're having your event. We have people with disabilities here. We have X number of wheelchair users. We have Y number of people who are sight impaired with service animals, because they're going to need special evacuation considerations if there's an earthquake. Yeah, that never happens in California, right? Like literally the only thing that hasn't happened in 2020 yet. Signage is really important. People who can't see obviously are not going to be able to read flat paper signs, with a thing that says registration with an arrow pointing around the corner. How are you going to tell people who are blind where the registration desk is so they could register? So you need to think through that. Do we send them email in advance where they can read the email with their screen readers? Do we have an app for our event? Some large events have apps. Has that been tested to work with a screen reader? Amenities, how to find the bathroom, how to find the plates for the buffet table. Those are all important. There are beacon-based systems out there that use low energy Bluetooth with an accessible app. So if you use one of those systems, or if you work with companies that use glasses, or the video on cameras to provide instructions for people who are blind through volunteers, that can be how you can provide remote assistance. Seating is important. I can't get to the middle seats, for example, in my wheelchair. I need a space on one of the edges, but also concurrently, I don't want to be blocking people. And I certainly don't want to be in the middle of traffic and have to have people climb over me. So that needs to be thought about. Accessible stages are important. It sends a really subconscious message, even if you don't have a speaker with a disability, that you care about accessibility as an issue. The first woman who ever won I believe it was a Tony Award for a Broadway show in a wheelchair, have access to an accessible stage to get her award. So I don't know what the hell they were thinking, but it wasn't about accessibility. Running around a microphone is important. Because you don't, especially if you're recording the event or if you're live casting it, you don't want people asking questions until they have the mic, because the captioners are not going to be able to pick up that information for the people who are watching it after the fact on the recording, or the people who are watching it remotely live. And then all kinds of last minute checks. I had one event that I went to. I looked, everything was fine. I came back an hour later, and there was an ice cream, one of those frozen ice cream things on wheels blocking the sidewalk, and somebody had covered up some electrical cords on the ground with one of those really hard plastic tents that I couldn't get my wheelchair over. So just because you have the thing accessible at one point in time doesn't mean it's going to stay accessible. People move planters, people move food. signs fall down. So make sure that the people who are walking the event, making sure that everything is fine, know to check for accessibility issues as well.
I think this is actually really important, right, Cherry? So for those outdoors areas and events, so often grass and sand dirts are not accessible to those using mobility devices. So they will need, you know, an accessible route. So think about that. And also event programs and maps, they should all include all accessibility information, as well as being able to provide Braille prints and prints with large fonts for visual disability. And there should be a disability service table at registration for those large or marquee events as well.
So if you want to build a Braille tactile map, your best bet is to go to a local lighthouse for the blind. They have services. You give them the printed map, or you can do it contactless. You can send them the PDF file, and for a small amount of money, they will send you back a custom tactile version of the map that you can give to somebody who's blind. And yes, doubling down on grass. Grass events are like literally the bane of my existence. Secret fun fact, those things on the floor that they tape together when people are moving heavy equipment in and out, those make perfect access for people who are wheelchair users or mobility device users on grass. So you just put those down, and then they've got something solid and level that they can roll on or crutch on, rather than being constantly looking out for gopher holes, which is very stressful, trust me. Okay, in terms of communications access, another topic near and dear to my heart because of my deaf daughter, you need to make sure that your platform is accessible. The most accessible platform out there is Zoom. So if you use Zoom, you're good. And if you use other platforms, you're going to need to investigate what their accessibility options are. Some are better than others, like GoToMeeting, I can't use because I don't use a mouse. So audience participation activities. You go to some of these events and they want to get the energy up, and so they, tell everybody to jump up and clap their hands, or, shake the hands of the person sitting next to you. Not all of these events are accessible. So think through that. There's a number of great icebreakers that you can do listed at the Perkins School for the Blind website, and I would suggest choosing one of those. Your templates have to be accessible. So we have used a VMware accessible template with VMware accessible colors, and we've made sure that all of our content is accessible. All of our bullet points and our page titles and our page numbers get picked up by the screen reader, and all of our pictures, when necessary, have descriptions. So for example, this one wouldn't need a description because the word event appears underneath it. That makes the picture redundant and decorative. It's faster for people who are screen reader users not to hear event and event, or person at whiteboard and event, because really they only need that text word underneath to know what's going on. But there's a accessibility checker in PowerPoint. There's also one in Adobe, and there's also one in Microsoft Word. So those are the three most popular platforms for creating material for these types of things. If you are creating in something like InDesign or Figma and then exporting to PDF, that is not going to be accessible to somebody who's blind. Captioning and CART. So we have two different ways of captioning. One is auto captioning, and of course mine has now turned off, I think. The access over the internet isn't always great for auto captioning. So the difference is auto captioning is being done by an AI-based system. Google Meets has it now, Microsoft Teams has it now, PowerPoint has it automatically. CART is real-time captioning. So that's a human who probably used to be a court reporter who is sitting on the line, and they are capturing what's being said. There are going to be fewer mistakes with CART than with captioning, with auto captioning, especially if you have people who don't speak English as their native language, or lots of really technical terms. At VMware, we hear the phrase Kubernetes a lot. And of course, VMware itself as a corporate name is not the easiest thing for an AI-based program to interpret. It's not going to be part of the default dictionary, and those come up with some very creative and inconsistent spellings. So CART is always going to be your better bet. And then sign language interpretation. You want to make that an option on your registration, and if people ask for it, then you need to provide an interpreter. Sometimes people will want to bring their own interpreters, in which case you'll need to make sure that if it's a physical event, that that interpreter has free access to the conference. If you're charging for the event, you should only be charging the person with the disability to attend. You should not be charging their interpreters or their assistants to attend. And then you've got your event follow-up. So the same thing applies here as applies to the event marketing, which we talked about, which is the first phase. Usually you're going to do a survey. Google Forms, Microsoft Forms, and SurveyMonkey are accessible. Everything else is lesser degrees of accessible, all the way down to not accessible at all. So until you get more familiar with accessibility, I would recommend using one of the ones that you know is going to be accessible, because then you can't possibly screw it up. Replays, you need to make sure that whatever replays that you make available are stored on an accessible page, and that are stored in a video system that supports captioning. And social media, any follow-ups you're going to do about what a great event it was, and you know, if you missed it, go here for the replay. All of that needs to be accessible as well. Okay, so takeaways. We are the largest minority group, 1.3 billion people. Part of the thing is that there's so many different types of disabilities, and none of the assistive technology that works for people who are blind doesn't work for people who are deaf, doesn't work for people with chronic pain, doesn't work for people with wheelchair. There's a wide amount of diversity in disability, and even when you look at one narrow area of disability like hearing loss, different people use different assistive technology. So it's hard sometimes to perceive people with disabilities as a single minority group, but if you did, we would be the largest minority group that there is. You can't claim that you're an inclusive organization if you're not providing access to everybody. The definition of inclusion is don't exclude, right? And when you're not making things accessible, you're automatically excluding people. Even if you don't get complaints, you are excluding people. There was a survey that said 91% of people with disabilities, when they ran across an inaccessible situation, didn't complain about it. And you know why? Because we're tired of complaining. We just move on to the competitor. So don't think that the lack of complaints is a sign that you don't have a problem. If you're not accessible, you have a problem. And there are what we call curb cuts. So the curb cuts came out when I was using a wheelchair when I was a child. It was a nightmare for my mother. My mother's 5 foot, 120 pounds, soaking wet on a good day. And I'm almost 6 feet tall. I was in a wheelchair. I had casts on both of my legs. I was wearing a back brace, and she had no curb cuts. She had no way of getting me from one side of the street to another side of the street. She didn't have accessible parking privileges. You know, if she was going to the store with me, she would have to leave me in the car because she had no way of getting me in. So a curb cut is referred, you know, the thing that you use to easily get from one side of the street to the other side of the street without having to step off the side of the curb. But who else uses it? Is it just for my mom pushing me in a wheelchair when I was a kid? No, it's for skateboarders. It's for people dragging luggage. It's for people pushing baby strollers. It's for, you know, Amazon delivering packages down a street. So a curb cut is something that is intended to benefit a person with a disability, but actually improves the situation also for people without disabilities. So accessible changes to events are curb cuts. They're going to make it better for everybody, and they're going to make them more inclusive. So finally, we have a few resources for you. This is the website for the W3, which is the organization that puts out the WCAG standard, sometimes referred to as WCAG, which Tamar referenced. And they've got a step-by-step list on how to make presentations accessible. Also, since all colleges have to be accessible because they get federal money, there's a lot of good resources. The one I happen to like the best is on San Jose State's college site. If you search for San Jose State and accessibility, you might find that presentation. They had a course that every single San Jose State professor went through to learn how to make things accessible for their disabled students. Okay, accessible virtual meetings. There's all kinds of information out there. I have a Medium blog, and there's a link to that on the very last slide. And I talk about the 10 things that make Zoom meetings more accessible. So there's a lot of little things that you can do that will drastically improve the experience for people with disabilities, but will also improve the experience for people without disabilities.
Yeah, that's right. So, and this one is from Duke University, and they wrote a really good post about making virtual events accessible, and that holds true to training and conferences as well. So, and then at the end of the specific blog, they also provide a handy checklist that you can, download and use. So this is really cool. And this is, what Sherry is talking about. If you are, looking for help, Sherry and I will be more than happy to support you on your journey. This is our contact information. Sherry writes a blog, I think, every week. So there's a lot of information that she can help and provide you as well. We'll be really happy to, walk you through and provide you with ideas on making your events more accessible. So thank you so much for sharing time with us today. Hope this was helpful. Sherry, if there's any last thoughts.
Do or do not. There is no try.
Exactly.
Make it accessible.
Yeah, accessibility is not an option, right? This is what to say.
Correct.
Thank you guys for being here with us.
That's good enough. Oh, you hadn't heard.